You wake up, you check the time, you already know what's coming. 9 hours of work minus a lunch you'll eat at your desk, minus the commute eating into both ends of your day. Now erase all of that. Erase clocks, erase jobs, erase the entire idea that your hours belong to someone else. What's actually left? What did a human being do with an entire day, 40,000 years before anyone invented the concept of employment? The answer is not what you'd expect, and it's not the miserable, exhausting, dawn-to-dusk survival grind that pop culture loves to imagine. In fact, the real answer is almost the opposite. And once you understand it, you'll never look at your own work week the same way again. Consider what a job actually requires: a fixed schedule set by someone else, a location you're obligated to show up to, a boss measuring your output, a wage paid in exchange for hours rather than results. None of that existed for the overwhelming majority of the roughly 300,000 years Homo sapiens has walked the planet. Writing is about 5,000 years old. Factories are a few hundred years old. The 8-hour workday is barely a century old, which means, statistically speaking, the job as you understand it is one of the newest inventions in the entire history of your species, not one of the oldest. Start with the biggest myth first. For most of the 20th century, anthropologists assumed prehistoric life was a constant, brutal scramble for food. Every waking hour spent hunting, foraging, and fighting off starvation. Then in 1966, an anthropologist named Marshall Solins presented research that completely upended that assumption. He called his idea the original affluent society, a term that sounds like a contradiction until you understand what he meant by it. Affluence doesn't have to mean having a lot. It can also mean wanting very little and getting it easily. Solins argued that hunter-gatherer societies weren't affluent because they had abundant possessions. They were affluent because their needs were small, and meeting those needs took far less time than anyone assumed. This was a radical reversal of the story people had been telling themselves for decades. The assumption had always been that human progress meant working our way up from a desperate, scarcity-driven past toward a comfortable, abundant present. Solins flipped that entirely. He suggested that scarcity itself, the constant sense of not having enough time or resources, might actually be a product of modern economic life, not a holdover from prehistoric hardship. In other words, your ancestors may have felt less rushed, not more, than you do right now. Here's where the data gets genuinely surprising. Anthropologist Richard Lee spent extended time in the 1960s studying the Jew/Huanzi, sometimes called the !Kongsan, in the Kalahari Desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth. If any group should have been working themselves to exhaustion just to survive, it would be a community living in a desert with limited water and unpredictable food sources. Instead, Lee's time allocation studies found that adults spent roughly 15 to 20 hours a week on subsistence activities, meaning the direct work of getting food. 15 to 20 hours. That's less than half of a standard modern work week in one of the least forgiving climates on the planet. So what happened with the rest of the day? This is the part that upends everything you've been trained to assume about ancient life. The remaining hours weren't spent scrambling for more food out of anxiety or fear. They were spent on rest, on socializing, on storytelling, on making and repairing tools, on childcare, and on simply existing without a task attached to it. Anthropologist James Sussman, who has spent decades living among and studying the Juhuanzi himself, describes this as a fundamentally different relationship with time itself. There was no clock demanding output. There was no manager measuring productivity. There was only the day and the tasks that needed doing within it, and once those tasks were done, the day belonged entirely to the person living it. Let's decode something important here, because the word work itself is doing a lot of hidden lifting in this story. Work, in the modern sense, means labor performed for someone else, in exchange for a wage, on a schedule that isn't yours to control. That specific arrangement, employment, is astonishingly recent. It only became the dominant way most humans spent their waking hours within the last few hundred years. Following the rise of factories, then offices, then the 8-hour, 5-day structure that most of the world still lives by today. Compare that to 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existing without it, and the modern job looks less like the natural order of things and more like a strange, temporary experiment. Now, none of this means prehistoric life was easy in every sense. Life expectancy was shorter. Disease and injury carried far higher stakes without modern medicine. Food security could break down during droughts or harsh seasons, and there were real periods of hardship and scarcity. This isn't a claim that everything about ancient life was better, but the specific narrow question of daily hours spent laboring tells a completely different story than the one most people carry around in their heads. Let's walk through an actual day, piece by piece, because the shape of it reveals just how differently time was structured. Mornings often meant checking traps, gathering plants, or setting out in small groups toward known food sources, guided by an intimate, generational knowledge of the land that modern humans have almost entirely lost. This wasn't mindless labor. It required tracking skills, plant knowledge, weather reading, and constant problem solving, the kind of cognitively rich work that modern hunter-gatherer studies suggest kept minds remarkably sharp and engaged. Reading a set of footprints meant estimating an animal's size, its age, how recently it passed, and which direction it was heading, all from a scattering of marks in the dirt that an untrained eye would walk right past. But once enough food was secured for the day, or for several days at once, depending on what was gathered, the obligation simply ended. There was no concept of clocking extra hours just because the sun hadn't set yet. If the food was in hand, the work was, functionally, done. Afternoons often shifted toward tool maintenance, sitting and talking, teaching children through direct demonstration rather than formal instruction, or simply resting through the hottest part of the day. This wasn't laziness. In many hot, arid environments, resting during peak heat was a matter of basic physiological sense, conserving water and energy for cooler hours when movement was safer and more efficient. Modern researchers studying thermoregulation, the body's process of managing its internal temperature, have pointed out that many traditional societies structured their daily rhythms around exactly this kind of heat avoidance pattern, something modern office culture with its air conditioning and fluorescent lighting completely ignores. Evenings, according to multiple ethnographic accounts of small-scale societies, were frequently built around fire, food sharing, and storytelling, sometimes stretching for hours. Researchers studying the Zhu Huanzi have noted that storytelling wasn't idle entertainment. It carried history, taught social rules, reinforced group cohesion, and passed down survival knowledge, all wrapped inside something that looked, on the surface, like simple leisure. Polly Wiesner, an anthropologist who studied firelight conversations among the Yu Huanzi specifically, found that daytime talk tended to focus on practical matters, complaints, and economic negotiation, while nighttime talk around the fire shifted dramatically toward stories, myths, and songs. She argued that firelight itself may have played a quiet but crucial role in human social development, creating a shared space where imagination, culture, and connection could stretch out after the practical demands of the day were finished. Now let's talk about who did what, because the division of daily activity wasn't random or identical across every member of a group. In many documented hunter-gatherer societies, labor was loosely divided along lines of sex, though far less rigidly than many assume. Research summarized across dozens of foraging societies generally shows men more often engaged in hunting larger mobile game, an activity that could require long-distance travel, patience, and sometimes multiple unsuccessful attempts before a single kill. Women more often focused on gathering plant foods, along with hunting smaller, more predictable game close to camp, a category of labor that across many studies actually contributed the larger and more reliable share of daily caloric intake in numerous foraging societies. This matters because it directly contradicts the old assumption that hunting alone kept prehistoric groups fed. Gathering, day in and day out, was frequently the more dependable food source, even if hunting captured more dramatic cultural attention then, and arguably still does in popular imagination now. Childcare, too, looked completely different from the modern nuclear family model. Anthropologist Sarah Hrdy has written extensively about what researchers call cooperative breeding, the idea that human children were traditionally raised not just by their biological parents, but by a broad, overlapping network of grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated group members, all sharing in feeding, carrying, and watching over the youngest members of the band. A modern parent juggling childcare almost entirely alone, squeezed between two working schedules, would have looked genuinely strange to a prehistoric community where the responsibility of raising a single child was distributed across an entire social network by default, not as an exceptional favor. Children themselves didn't experience anything resembling a modern school day either. Anthropological studies of groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, researched extensively by Frank Marlowe and later by researchers including Alyssa Crittenden, describe children learning almost entirely through play, observation, and gradual participation rather than structured lessons. Young children accompanied older children and adults on foraging trips, picked up small, manageable tasks early, such as helping locate baobab fruit or digging for tubers, and slowly took on more complex responsibilities as they aged, without ever sitting through anything resembling a classroom. Crittenden's research on Hadza children specifically found that even very young foragers contributed meaningfully to their own caloric intake through play-based foraging, blurring the line between what a modern observer would separate into work and play. Which brings us to a genuinely important distinction this whole topic hinges on. The difference between subsistence labor and leisure wasn't nearly as sharp in prehistoric daily life as it is in yours. When your work and your personal life are separated by a commute, a badge swipe, and a scheduled lunch break, the line is obvious. But when the task in front of you is gathering food alongside your sister while catching up on group gossip, teaching your child to identify edible roots while wandering together anyway, or repairing a tool while sitting with friends around a fire, the boundary between labor and life essentially dissolves. Sussman has argued this blending is one of the most fundamentally different aspects of how time was experienced before large-scale agriculture and industry reorganized human days into rigid, separated blocks. Here's the counterintuitive twist that makes this whole story land differently than you'd expect. You would assume that as human societies developed agriculture, then cities, then industry, then technology, that people would work less over time, not more. Machines were supposed to save labor, technology was supposed to buy back hours. Instead, something close to the opposite happened for enormous stretches of history. The shift to agriculture actually increased daily labor hours substantially, tying entire communities to the demands of planting seasons, harvests, and land ownership in a way that foraging never required. A field doesn't forgive a missed week the way a foraging territory does. Crops need constant tending, storage requires constant defense from spoilage and theft, and land ownership introduces an entirely new problem hunter-gatherers rarely faced: the need to protect a fixed resource that couldn't simply be walked away from during a lean season. Archaeological evidence backs this up in an unexpected way. Skeletal remains from early agricultural populations frequently show signs of harder physical strain, more repetitive stress injuries, and in many regions, shorter average stature compared to earlier foraging populations. A pattern researchers have linked to poorer, less varied diets combined with heavier, more constant physical labor. In other words, the transition that's often taught as pure human progress may have actually made daily life measurably more physically demanding for a significant stretch of history, even as it enabled larger populations, permanent settlements, and eventually the cities and technologies you rely on today. Then industrialization pushed hours even further, with some 19th century factory workers logging 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week. Entire families, including young children, were pulled into factory labor schedules that dwarfed anything documented among hunter-gatherer societies. The 8-hour workday wasn't a gift handed down naturally. It was fought for through labor movements across the late 1800s and early 1900s as a correction to conditions that had actually gotten worse, not better, compared to how earlier humans spent their time. The famous slogan from those labor movements, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, was a demand to claw back something that industrial capitalism had taken away, not a discovery of some brand new, more civilized way to live. So the modern 40-hour work week isn't some evolved, optimized system built on thousands of years of human refinement. It's a relatively recent compromise, born out of industrial-era labor disputes, layered on top of a species that spent the overwhelming majority of its existence working dramatically fewer structured hours than it does today. And even that 40-hour standard has been quietly eroding in the other direction again, with unpaid overtime, blurred remote work boundaries, and constant digital connectivity stretching many modern jobs well past their official hours, in a way that would have been completely unfamiliar to a Jew/Huansi forager finishing their gathering for the day and simply stopping. This is where the mirror turns back toward you. That nagging feeling of burnout, that sense that something about the modern grind feels unnatural, isn't just in your head. Your ancestors' bodies and minds evolved inside a rhythm of intense, purposeful activity, followed by genuine, unstructured rest, day after day, for hundreds of thousands of years. The 9 to 5, the always-on inbox, the blurred line between work hours and personal hours, none of that matches the rhythm your biology was actually shaped by. You're not weak for feeling exhausted by a system that, historically speaking, is still brand new. You're responding exactly the way a human would be expected to respond to something this foreign to how the species spent almost its entire existence. There's also something worth noticing about the quality of ancient labor, not just the quantity. The tasks that filled those 15 to 20 hours a week weren't repetitive or disconnected from outcome the way modern work sometimes is. Tracking an animal meant reading its footprints, its droppings, the bend of disturbed grass, and predicting where it would go next. Gathering plants meant knowing exactly which ones were ripe, which were poisonous, and which ones would still be there next season if harvested correctly. Every task had a visible, immediate result tied directly to the person doing it. Compare that to a modern job where the connection between your daily effort and any tangible outcome can feel abstract, delayed, or entirely invisible. Some researchers studying modern burnout suggest this disconnect between effort and visible result is itself part of why modern work can feel so much more draining than its hours alone would suggest. None of this means going back to foraging is realistic or even desirable, given everything modern life also provides, including medicine, security, and comfort your ancestors never had. But understanding how differently your ancestors spent their days offers something valuable. It reframes the exhaustion. It explains why 4-day workweek experiments, currently being studied and piloted across companies in the UK, Iceland, and elsewhere, keep showing that people can often do the same amount of meaningful work in significantly less time, echoing something closer to what Solons found decades ago in a completely different context. Early results from some of these trials have reported that employee stress and burnout dropped while productivity held steady or even improved, a pattern that would have felt entirely unremarkable to a Huansi forager watching a modern office worker's calendar. It suggests that scarcity of time might be more of a modern invention than a fundamental human condition. There's an important nuance here worth sitting with, though, because it's easy to romanticize this comparison into something it isn't. The relatively light subsistence workload documented among modern foraging societies doesn't mean life was leisurely in every sense. Infant mortality was significantly higher than in the modern industrialized world. Injuries that would be minor today, a broken bone, an infected wound, a difficult birth, could become life-threatening without modern medical intervention. The freedom from a fixed schedule existed alongside real vulnerability to circumstances entirely outside anyone's control. The point isn't that prehistoric life was universally better. The point is much narrower and arguably more useful. The specific number of hours spent laboring each day, the thing your modern calendar revolves entirely around, was not always as large and not always as separated from rest and connection as the popular imagination assumes. Let's talk about sleep too, because it turns out even nighttime looked completely different, and it directly challenges another modern assumption. For years, popular wellness culture has pushed the idea that ancient humans, without electric light or screens, must have slept longer and more soundly than modern people do. Neuroscientist Jerome Siegel led a landmark study in 2015 examining sleep patterns among 3 modern foraging and hunter horticulturalist groups, including the Hadza of Tanzania and the San of Namibia, using actual wearable sleep tracking devices rather than guesswork. The results surprised almost everyone in the field. These groups slept an average of about 6.5 hours a night, not the 9 or 10 hours popular assumption expected. They also didn't nap heavily during the day, and they didn't fall asleep the moment it got dark, often staying up for hours after sunset around the fire. What Siegel's research did find, however, was strikingly low rates of insomnia across all three groups, almost negligible compared to modern industrialized populations, along with a sleep pattern tightly synced to natural temperature drops in the environment rather than an artificial bedtime. In other words, ancient humans likely weren't sleeping dramatically more than you do. They were simply sleeping in sync with their bodies and their environment, without the anxiety, screen exposure, and irregular scheduling that disrupts so much modern sleep. The quantity wasn't radically different. The quality and the lack of dread around it very likely was. It's also worth remembering that none of this looked the same everywhere or in every season. Daily rhythms shifted considerably depending on climate, geography, and time of year, and lumping every prehistoric human into one single daily template would be its own kind of oversimplification. Groups living in resource-rich coastal or riverine environments, well documented among certain indigenous societies in the Pacific Northwest prior to European contact, sometimes had access to such reliably abundant salmon runs that they developed semi-permanent settlements, elaborate art, and complex social hierarchies, all while still operating outside anything resembling formal employment. Meanwhile, groups in more marginal environments like the Kalahari studied by Lee faced tighter margins and more variability season to season, sometimes working somewhat harder during lean months and considerably less during abundant ones. Anthropologists studying Aboriginal Australian societies before European colonization found similarly striking patterns. Time allocation research in some regions estimated subsistence work in the range of 4 to 5 hours a day on average, with entire seasons built around ceremony, trade gatherings between different groups, and elaborate storytelling traditions tied to what's often translated as the dreaming, a complex system of law, history, and cosmology passed down orally across countless generations without a single written record. None of that cultural infrastructure was built during stolen moments squeezed between shifts of exhausting labor. It was built because there was time consistently for it to be built. This cross-cultural pattern is part of why Solon's original findings held up so well over the following decades, even as some of his specific numbers were debated and refined by later researchers. Whether you look at the Kalahari, the Australian outback, or river-based communities along the Pacific coast, a recurring theme shows up again and again. Complex art, music, storytelling, and elaborate social ritual weren't luxuries invented after humans finally secured enough free time through modern efficiency. They were present, richly developed, deep in prehistory, built directly into daily and seasonal rhythms that left ample room for exactly this kind of cultural investment. It's worth pausing on why this particular myth, the exhausting, brutal caveman grind, took such deep root in the first place. Part of it traces back to philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who in the 17th century famously described pre-civilized human life as nasty, brutish, and short, an idea that shaped Western thinking about prehistory for the next 300 years, long before anyone had actually gathered field data on how foraging societies spent their time. Hobbes was writing philosophy, not anthropology, but his framing stuck, partly because it conveniently justified the idea that organized government, hierarchy, and structured labor were necessary improvements on a miserable natural state. If prehistoric life was assumed to be a desperate, ceaseless struggle, then any system that promised order, however demanding, could be framed as an obvious upgrade. That framing carried enormous weight for centuries because almost no one had first-hand evidence to challenge it. It wasn't until the 20th century when anthropologists actually began living alongside remaining foraging societies and tracking their daily activities with something resembling scientific rigor that the philosophical assumption started colliding directly with observed reality. Solons and the anthropologists who followed him weren't just correcting a factual error, they were dismantling centuries of assumption that had shaped how entire societies justified the systems they built, including the very idea that a demanding, structured workweek was simply the natural cost of being civilized rather than a specific historical choice. There's a similar myth worth unpacking around technology and tools, because it's tempting to assume that ancient daily life must have been consumed by the sheer difficulty of making anything by hand. In reality, toolmaking itself often functioned the way a modern hobby or craft session might, a task performed socially, often while talking, teaching, or simply sitting comfortably rather than laboring under pressure. Flint knapping, the process of shaping stone tools by carefully striking off flakes, required real skill, but skilled practitioners could produce a functional blade in a matter of minutes once trained, not hours. Studies of modern experimental archaeologists replicating ancient toolmaking techniques have found that many everyday stone and wood tools could be produced or repaired quickly enough to fit comfortably inside an afternoon already filled with rest and conversation, rather than representing a separate, exhausting category of labor layered on top of everything else. Art followed a similar pattern. Cave paintings dating back tens of thousands of years, found in sites across Europe and Indonesia, required sourcing pigments, preparing surfaces, and often working deep inside dark, difficult-to-access cave systems by firelight. None of that happens in a society where every hour is consumed by desperate survival. Elaborate, technically skilled art requires exactly the kind of unhurried, secure time that Solons's data suggests these societies actually had. The existence of ancient art isn't just a nice cultural footnote sitting beside the economic story, it's direct evidence supporting it. So the next time your alarm goes off and the day ahead feels like it belongs to someone else's schedule rather than your own, remember that for the overwhelming majority of human history, that wasn't the deal. There was no manager, there was no clock, there was only the day. And once the essential work of living was done, the rest of it belonged to you. You wake up, you check the time. But for almost all of human history, no one was checking it for you.